You're listening to the Lanterns Radio Network. We are the network dedicated to empowering the individual, illuminating the truth, defending American exceptionalism, and inspiring future generations. Stay connected and get involved at lanterns.buzz for great radio. Get commentary and news of the day. Lanterns.buzz.
Welcome, fellow patriots. Get ready for an hour of unabashedly pro-American, pro-conservative, and pro-biblical principles. This is the Blake Johnson Program.
And welcome everyone to the Blake Johnson Program. It is so awesome to be here with you once again in 2018, very first show of the new year. Hope you've been enjoying however long you've had off for vacation, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a couple of days, however long it was. I hope you enjoyed the time to spend with your family and friends. But man, I have to tell you, it is so great to be back here doing the show once again for the new year, 2018, and I'm excited for what's going to take place in regards to this show, where we're going to head in terms of, different things I'm going to try here, different segments, and so on and so forth. It's really going to be a lot of fun. So if you're just joining us, if this is the very first show of the Blake Johnson Program, very first episode that you've ever listened to, thank you for choosing to listen in, and welcome to it. Glad to have you a part of the team. That's what I refer to all of us as, a team, one big team. So, thank you for stopping by, checking this show out, and I hope you enjoy it. For those of you who have somehow stayed with me after, it's been about 6 months. And I am fighting off a cold. Great way to start the new year. It's been about 6 months since this show first launched on the Lanterns Radio Network. And I am ready. I am ready for the new year. New year brings new attitude, and that's been my focus for the direction I want to head for this show. Because last year it felt like we spent, or at least I spent, a lot of time talking about current events, which is fine. I enjoy that. But I want to really start to focus, to hone in more on things that matter even more than current events. Because in all reality, the way that I look at it as a conservative, as a free thinker, as I'm sure many of you consider yourselves to be free thinkers, defenders of liberty, promoters of American exceptionalism, I look at it as, if we want to figure out where we want to go as a country, as a society, we have to take a look at the foundation of who we are, where we came from. What makes this country so great? What makes it stand out so much? I heard an analogy that I was so accurate and so fitting. And I was just listening to the Steve Day show, and he was talking about how you look at a table. Well, what's the thing that you mostly look at when you see a table? Well, it's the tabletop, right? It's the top. It's where you put everything on top of, right? But in order for that tabletop to really function properly, it has to have legs, right? It has to have sturdiness. It has to have, the things that make it stand up, the things that prop it up. You can't just have a tabletop and call that good. There has to have a foundation for it. The same with a house. You can't just have a roof. You have to have, and you can't just have walls. You have to have a foundation for that property. So that's the way I look at, politics, and the way I look at culture, and the way I try to look at current events is, what does this mean? Where does this come from? How do we answer some of these difficult questions? But we have to go back to the foundation. Because if we don't have a foundation, well then we we stumble and fall, we crash, we fail. And I mean, obviously as a Christian, I'm sure this comes to mind. It's like building your house on sand. If sand is your foundation, then the house is going to come down. But if it's built on solid rock, if it's built on something secure, well then it will stand. So, with that being said, especially since this is an election year, I want to focus especially on our principles, because there's going to be a lot of elections throughout this country, throughout the different states. I don't know what all states, the listeners of this program are from. Some of you may be on the other side of the country, in Washington, D.C., or maybe California, God forbid, if you're a conservative anyway, or if you just like keeping your own money and not having the government shove their rules and regulations down your throat. Or you may be, I don't know, maybe you're in England. I don't know if there's anyone internationally that listens to this show, but I think we all share that same, the same basic ideas. We may have slight disagreements on how to get there, but we all agree that freedom is the best option. So that's why I want to focus on things that really matter. So that way when you go to the voting booth, or even before then, especially before then, when you're digging deep into the issues, finding out who to vote for, what amendments to vote for or against, etc., you've done your homework. Wait, does this go with what the founders would want? Does this add up? Does this work? Well, that's my goal for this year, is to focus, to go back to the basics. So, we're going to have fun, though. It's going to be a lot of fun. We'll talk about some history, things that are pretty interesting that not many people are aware of or haven't really done a whole lot of study into. But especially, I want to focus on some of the founding principles of this country, of what the founding fathers intended for us, but also the founding principles of conservatism, which really it goes hand in hand, in my opinion. Conservatism goes hand in hand with what our founding fathers believed in. In fact, that's what conservatism is all about. It's conserving the ideas that have made this country so successful and great. And ultimately, as a Christian, it also means conserving biblical truths. And you heard it in that intro, talking about pro-American, pro-biblical values, pro-conservative values, and they really all go hand in hand. They all work together. So, I could start the show off, and I suppose I'll get to it eventually in the program, talking about President Trump's tweets. I tell you, it in some ways it's humorous because the president is very good at getting the left to react to every single thing he says and to focus solely on him, which in some ways is a good thing because it allows Congress to hopefully get some things passed that will help you and me. But on the other hand, some of his tweets, some of the things that he says, really do not help the cause whatsoever. They really don't. And I may spend some time on that later, but I don't want to focus so much on one person and one personality, one celebrity. I don't want them to control the direction of where we need to go. We should allow our principles to control that. We should allow our souls that are hopefully wrapped in Scripture, hopefully wrapped in things of lasting value, to guide the way. And that's why I want to spend the first part of the show talking about one of my favorite topics, one of my favorite principles of this country, and that's federalism. Federalism is really one of the bedrock principles, one of the bedrock foundations of this country and the way it was built. It was set up by our founders to be a country that valued freedom, especially when it came to the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. And you think about all the amendments, the ones that are so important. Well, they're all important, of course. But really, one of my top favorites, if I had to pick, the top 3, if you will, of my favorites, or top 5, the 10th Amendment would be one of the top 5. Probably the top 3. And this is really where federalism comes from. It says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. And when you think about it, obviously the Constitution, it talks about the different powers and things that are up to the government, the things that the government must take care of, national security being one of them, having strong borders, ensuring domestic tranquility, things of that nature, and it's all laid out, a lot of it in the preamble. But, there are certain things that are not delegated to the federal government. And there are for a variety of reasons for that, partly because the founders didn't know all the things, like technology, that would really boom and change the way we live. But don't mistake what I'm saying. That doesn't mean that the Constitution should therefore be changed. Because the beauty of the Constitution is, yes, there is a process to add amendments to it. However, what makes it great is the fact that, yes, even though there are changes that come with, society and culture and technology and things of that nature, the principles of the Constitution stay the same. They still work 240 some years later. And that's why I love our Constitution so much. The only Constitution that has yet to be changed. It's the longest lasting one. But back to federalism. What was the purpose of this new federal system? I'm reading from, by the way, I would highly recommend, check out Mark Levin's book, Liberty and Tyranny. It's a conservative manifesto. And in this book, he spends a whole chapter talking about federalism. And I figured it would be pretty appropriate to read from it because he's a constitutional scholar and a top conservative thinker. But he talks about this idea of federalism. He says, along with limiting federal power and separating that power among 3 competing branches, being, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, the federal system would help ensure that the Revolution's principles, as set forth in the Declaration of Independence and the civil society itself, would be safeguarded. States are governmental entities that reflect the personalities, characteristics, histories, and priorities of the individuals who choose to inhabit them. They have diverse geographies, climates, resources, and populations. No 2 states are alike. The same can be said of the cities, towns, and hamlets within the states, which number in the tens of thousands and dot the nation's landscape. States are more likely to better reflect the interests of their citizens than the federal government, which was the point, by the way. The founders didn't want it to be a one-size-fits-all system because they knew, even though they didn't know the specifics of it, they knew as time went on there would be new questions, new developments that would take place in this country. So, some states would be, maybe they would try experiments on this or that, and, they could do that without violating people's rights. So, again, more freedom. Now, before I jump back in, some of you may be wondering, what's the point of all this? Why are you just randomly talking about this? Well, because it relates to what's going on today. And I think in order to really be able to understand what's going on today, we have to understand, again, where we came from. But back to this. Let's see. Moreover, the interaction between the people and their representatives at the state and local levels is easier and more direct. When the federal government acts beyond its constitutional limits, it assaults the purest form of representative government by supplanting representative decision-making at the state and local levels. The federal government cannot possibly comprehend the diversity of interests that are affected by its decision-making. It cannot adequately weigh the costs and benefits of decisions on communities. Besides, that's not its purpose. It seeks to dictate rather than represent. Federalism has other profound benefits. As Associate Justice Louis Brandeis wrote, quote, "A single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country." For the framers, experimentation, like change, was a matter of prudence. As previously described, change should be informed by the experience, knowledge, and traditions of society, tailored for a specific purpose, and accomplished through a constitutional construct that ensures thoughtful deliberation by the community. Change unconstrained by prudence produces unpredictable consequences, threatening ordered liberty with chaos and ultimately despotism, and placing at risk the very principles the conservative holds dear. So what's he saying here? He's saying that, yes, experimentation is a good thing. Change is a good thing. We should be people who are open to change. But at the same time, that willingness to change has to be rooted in principle. And you'll hear me say that word a lot. Principle, 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 values, principles. These things are important. You can't just say, well, I'm going to change just because I can. You know, you look at the current, the way that society defines marriage. Well, that's changed, but is that change necessarily a good thing? Is it a good thing that the Supreme Court decided that marriage is no longer between a man and a woman? Is that the proper role of the Supreme Court, of government? Is it the proper role of, is it good? Is it prudent? Is it wise for society to decide that, we could just change the definition of marriage? Or, life, it doesn't really matter as much. I mean, you can kill an unborn life within such and such period of time. So change isn't always a good thing. It's got to be rooted in principle. Which, again, that's why we drifted from the Articles of Confederation to the United States Constitution. The reason we did that, primarily, was because the founders understood that, the Articles themselves did not establish a workable governing system. It was too close to anarchy. The people became too independent. And there's a problem with that. Independence is a good thing. But what's it wrapped in? What is it? Just I can do whatever the heck I want and pay no heed to my neighbor? Just be completely selfish? I mean, the libertarian might tell you yes. But that's not what our founders intended. That's not what God intended for his people. I'm going to take a break and come back, and we'll continue this discussion on federalism because it's really important. It is very important. And also debunking this idea that because of federalism, we got slavery, and therefore federalism is bad, therefore there has to be a stronger central government. You'll hear that argument from the left when you talk about federalism, when that idea comes up. We will address that here on the Blake Johnson program. Stay tuned. We'll be right back in just a minute. Yes, this is indeed the Blake Johnson program, and it is an honor to have you here, as it always is. Returning to the topic of federalism today. Like I said, I really want this show to focus a lot on our founding principles and delve deeper. I don't want this to be a reactionary show that just looks at what's going on currently in the news and have a reaction to it. I mean, we will obviously spend time on those things, but I think we also really have to return to our roots. Because if you look at the education system in this country, you will see that in many aspects of this nation, particularly in the public school system, you will see that there is growing progressivism in the school system. And by progressivism, I don't mean progressivism towards Christ or progressivism towards a better and deeper understanding of freedom and free market capitalism and limited government. I mean a progression away from those principles to the idea that man is better. Man is better essentially than God. That's what it really comes down to. And we'll talk more about that as the weeks and months go by into the ideas of progressivism and why it's so deadly. But we are a society that is lost when it comes to just understanding the basics of what we believe in, knowing the why of what we claim to believe. And in this topic of federalism, this is something that not just conservatives, but also Democrats, liberals, independents, those who lean to the left, those who lean to the right, those who are somewhere in the middle, this is something that if you are an American, you should be able to rally around. Because federalism works for both liberals and conservatives, for everybody. That's what it was designed for. Before we took a break, I was talking about how the framers championed experimentation. They championed each state being able to, as long as they weren't violating the rights in the Constitution, as long as they weren't violating the Bill of Rights, they could go and experiment and try new things within their own state. And this is something that I think that you would think that liberals would be all for. There are multiple examples of this experimentation working. For example, if you look at the 1980s, you look at the state of Oregon and their welfare system, their welfare reform experiment became so successful that it became a model not only for the other states, but also for the federal government. If you look at Milwaukee and their experiment with school vouchers, well, that sparked a movement across this country. Now you have school voucher programs all over the U.S. If you look at, just experimentation in general, to be properly understood, it's a dynamic characteristic of federalism, which exists between, among, and within the various states. Now, I also said that experimentation isn't always a good thing. It doesn't always work out. If you look at Maryland, when they passed a computer services tax, this technology sector threatened to relocate to neighboring Virginia, which had no such tax. Maryland repealed the tax, but other states learned from Maryland's experiment. And if you also look, and here's the thing too, let's say you're in California, and you want to try big government healthcare in the state of California. Well, you can do that. But don't expect people in Texas or Nevada or Florida or other places to have to abide by those ideas, those laws, if you will. But one of the best things about federalism is mobility. The idea that if you don't like the system of your state, if you don't like the way the government is run in your state, then you can move. If you don't like all the income, the state taxes, whether it's, income taxes or, corporate taxes or, individual taxes and other kinds of sales taxes that they try to pass. If you don't like all those things, say you want to move to Texas that has no state income tax, well, you can move there. You can do that. Likewise, if you feel suddenly charitable and you want to pay more taxes, then by all means, move to California, move to New York, move to New Hampshire, or Maine, or Rhode Island, or wherever you want to go. Move to wherever you want to be. Mobility is probably the most important aspect of federalism. Again, reading from Mark Levin's Liberty and Tyranny, which, if you're a conservative, you have to read this book. This explains all of the principles of conservatism and all which comes from the founding of this country and how it aligns directly with our framers. But just look at mobility and how it helps people like you and me. For example, today, large industrial states, which burden their citizens and businesses with high taxes and excessive regulations, are depopulating themselves. Individuals are taking their assets and moving to other parts of the country. Some are moving to states like Florida or Nevada because they have no income tax, like I just said, or they are relocating their businesses to Alabama because it's a right-to-work state. People move to different states for an infinite amount of reasons. Federalism promotes decentralized government, which empowers the individual to choose whether to stay in one place and try to influence the state and local decision-making, or take up residence in another state or locality. There is no escaping the reach of the federal government, however, unless one gives up on the country altogether and leaves for other shores, which speaks to how serious the issues of universal health care, federally mandated health care, why it's so important to understand that that is not in the Constitution. That is unconstitutional. And quite frankly, the federal income tax is not something that the Founding Fathers would have championed. But because it was pushed through Woodrow Wilson, and originally it was because of the war, and they had to have a way to pay for the war, but because of progressivism, they decided, let's go ahead and keep this. Even though we don't need it anymore, let's just go ahead and keep it because, well, we like to tax people. We like to get more of their money. It's insulting. It's quite frankly immoral for that to be there. But again, when you understand progressivism, when you understand liberalism and how not just liberalism itself, but radical liberalism, the idea of forcing you to pay for things that, quite frankly, you shouldn't have to pay for. Federalism keeps that from you. You shouldn't have to pay for anything where your money could go to possibly Planned Parenthood, or could go to, just whatever company that you don't really care for, some, global warming or climate change company. You shouldn't have to pay for that. Under federalism, you don't have to. You can move if you want to. But the federal government for sure does not have the right to force you to pay for something that you don't want. However, one of the most dramatic events undermining state constitutional authority came with the ratification of the 17th Amendment on April 8, 1913. The 17th Amendment changed the method by which senators were chosen from being elected or selected by the state legislatures, ensuring that the state governments would have a direct and meaningful voice in the operation of the federal government, to direct popular election by the citizens of each state. A rising tide of progressivism and populism resulted in enough states ratifying the amendment that they largely did process. Now, this is something I will definitely delve into as the weeks go by, but the 17th Amendment to the United States Constitution is an abomination. It goes directly against everything the founders stood for. And, many of you may not be, or maybe not you, but friends of yours may not be used to hearing that. They think, well, why wouldn't you be for the 17th Amendment? Why wouldn't you be for, popular vote and people being able to choose their own leaders? Well, that is a direct threat to the Republic. We are not a democracy, and thank God for that. You hear the Democrats talking about getting rid of the Electoral College and being based purely on popular vote. The only reason they do that is so they can win elections. They don't care about freedom, care about getting their own butts in seats and taking away more of your rights, filling their own pockets with cash. That's all they really care about. They don't care about you. But understanding all of this takes time, it takes research, it takes effort. And that's something that the liberals, the progressive liberals, are counting on you not to do. And quite frankly, many in the Republican Party. Even with the elimination of the direct representation in the Senate, the states independently possessed considerable authority under the Constitution. Consequently, for the statist, federalism, like free markets and private property, remained a major obstacle to amassing power. Therefore, he would have to subvert the Constitution to achieve his ends, which he did. Alright, now, continuing on here, we're going to talk about federalism. One of the common arguments that people will make is, how could you possibly be for federalism when, in fact, that's what caused state governments to enslave and oppress African Americans? It's what brought us the Civil War. Well, that's misleading for a couple of reasons. First of all, It's a misreading of history to singularly condemn federalism for slavery. While there is no debating or excusing that Southern states sanctioned slavery, at times they did so with the help of the federal government. Moreover, there is also no questioning that other states, mostly in the North, instituted policies and laws not only prohibiting slavery within their own borders, but defying efforts by the Southern states and the federal government to enforce slavery in the South. For example, prior to the Civil War, and at the behest of the Southern states, in 1793 and 1850, the federal fugitive slave laws were enacted to force recalcitrant northern states to return escaped slaves to their southern owners. Many northern states resisted by passing personal liberty laws, which created legal obstacles to the deportation of slaves back to the South. In the 1842 Prigg versus Pennsylvania case, the federal Supreme Court ruled these laws unconstitutional, arguing that they sought to preempt federal law, although it added that the northern states were not required to affirmatively assist the southern states that sought the return of escaped slaves. In 1857, the court ruled in Dred Scott versus Sanford that no slaves or descendants of slaves could be. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, which prohibited slavery in much of the new territories, was unconstitutional, for it denied slave owners their personal property rights. As a result, the court not only denied the slave the ability to escape one state tyranny for another state's freedom, a direct assault on a critical aspect of federalism, of mobility, but it actually expanded slavery throughout the country, which helped precipitate the Civil War. So, this notion that federalism is what caused slavery, no, quite the opposite. It was tyranny. It was despotism. It was the federal government that prevented people from escaping slavery. And to me, that tells the whole story right there. That when left to the federal government, when power is left to the federal government, when power is left to unelected judges on the Supreme Court to decide what the law should be, to decide what freedom should be, that's not always a good thing. It doesn't always work out. When progressives, when big government leaders get into power, and when the people decide not to really pay much attention and to just give them more power, don't be surprised if they start to abuse the very system that you claim to champion. That's why we have to return to federalism. You know, there's a debate going on in this country over the legalization of marijuana. And should that be allowed? And it appears that the president wants it to go back to the states. Well, as a Christian, I don't agree with smoking marijuana. I don't think it's good. I don't think it's healthy. I don't think it's moral. However, from a legal perspective, if you want to base it on the Constitution, I think the Constitution clearly would say that it should go to the states. And we may delve more into that later. I mean, I do think, though, that there is an argument to be made that you don't want to just completely legalize it, though. That there is merit in having some restriction that is still not unconstitutional to have such restriction. Because, again, morality is also important. Not just law, but morality. We have to be a moral and upright people. But in all things, what it really comes down to, if you are a free thinker, if you consider yourself to be a conservative or a libertarian, or even if you consider yourself to be a liberal, these things should matter to you. Being able to make your own choices, as long as they are not infringing upon somebody else's rights, as long as they are not infringing upon life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, well, then you should be free to make your own choices, to live your own life, to make your own way. But we have drifted too far from that. And instead of talking about these things, instead of understanding these principles, understanding where we came from and why it's important to return back to those ideals, instead, we have lowered ourselves to knowing so much about pop culture, knowing so much about fiction and fictional books and movies and so on and so forth. We've become so obsessed with that that we don't even care anymore what lawmakers are doing. We don't even care anymore about the rights that are being trampled on every single day. And then somehow we get outraged that they're being trampled on in the first place. Well, you can't be outraged if you're not paying attention. You can't be outraged if you don't even care, if you pay no heed to what's going on in this nation. We have got to return to what made this country the way it is. Well, I was going to say the way it is today. The way it used to be. The way our founders intended. But if you listen to the lies from the progressives, then you will be led to believe that small government is bad. That, allowing states to decide for themselves what they want to do is bad because some states don't make good decisions. So we've got to make sure they make the right decisions. Well, who decides that? The government? The federal government? The bureaucracy? How about the people? The people that live in those states. The people that, like I said earlier, that are in more of a direct relationship with the lawmakers of that state. I don't care what you guys do in Virginia or Delaware or Rhode Island or any of the other states. Do what you want. But don't force me to comply if I don't want to comply. If we would just restore federalism, we'd be so much better off. We'll take a break on the Blake Johnson program, come back, and get into some news of the day, as we probably should, when we come back.
You're listening to the Lanterns Radio Network. We are the network dedicated to empowering the individual, illuminating the truth, defending American exceptionalism, and inspiring future generations. Stay connected and get involved at lanterns.buzz for great radio. Get commentary and news of the day. Lanterns.buzz.
Welcome back, everyone. This is the Blake Johnson program on the Lanterns Radio Network, where we are here to fix the machine. And if you haven't already, I would encourage you to check out the other programs on this show, as long as you listen to mine as your number one top priority. That's basically the unspoken agreement that you and I have already agreed to. It's trust me, it's written up. It's out there. Don't even think about it. But as long as my show is number one for you, you can sometimes check on other shows if you feel sorry for them. But no, check out Defenders of American Exceptionalism, Common Sense Radio, Battle for Freedom with Watson Prunier. The Bells of Liberty do a great job. And oh man, we have so many other programs. HollowNet Live, I believe, is one of them. We've got just all kinds of different shows, different personalities that have different takes on much of the same things we talk about. We talk about the same basic principles because we all believe in the same principles of liberty and limited government and freedom and personal responsibility and morality and things of that nature. So it's always good if you can sometimes get a slightly different angle than you're used to getting from the best of the best, which would be me. So, anyway. Oh my gosh, I make friends easily, as you can tell. But, oh man, unfortunately, as much as I love being here, there are times when I'm like, man, sometimes we have to talk about things that we don't want to talk about, right? And that's the way life works. Sometimes, if you're in a relationship with somebody, whether it's a friendship or something more, eventually, you have to have a talk. And that's never fun. Look, here's the thing. And I feel like I have to make this disclaimer almost every time, if not every other time, that I talk about the president. Because I think it's important for you to understand where I'm coming from, my bias, where I lean towards, how I view things. That way when I say something, you can understand why I'm saying it, because I already have this viewpoint anyway, and you'll understand where I'm coming from. As much as I support the president's policy agenda, there are times when I really take issue with some of the things that he says. And some of the things he says are really good. Some of the things are kind of funny. Some of the things, even though they aren't what you would typically hear from a president, I don't have much of a problem with. But sometimes he'll put his foot in his mouth. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is why I didn't vote for you in 2016. Case in point, over the weekend, the president decided to brag about his genius. And I'll delve more deeply into it later, because there's a couple audio clips I want to play for you of this interview on CNN. This back and forth between Jake Tapper and senior advisor to Donald Trump, Stephen Miller. And at one point they talk about this tweet, a couple of tweets that the president sent. He starts off by saying, now that Russian collusion, after 1 year of intense study, has proven to be a total hoax on the American public, the Democrats and their lapdogs, this is the president saying all this, the fake news mainstream media are taking out the old Ronald Reagan playbook and screaming mental stability and intelligence. Actually, throughout my life, my two greatest assets have been mental stability and being, like, really smart. Crooked Hillary Clinton also played these cards very hard and, as everyone knows, went down in flames. I went from very successful businessman to top TV star to President of the United States on my first try. I think that would qualify as not smart but genius, and a very stable genius at that. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. Here we go again with Donald Trump once again showing his arrogance, showing needless childish behavior. And for what? What does this accomplish? What the heck does this accomplish? Before you throw whatever it is you're listening to this show on, whether it be your phone or tablet, because you're so mad at me for daring to question the President of the United States, I will get into that more, but there's a reason I'm talking about this. Now, in relation to this, as I said, Stephen Miller, senior advisor to the president, went on CNN to speak to Jake Tapper, a journalist and a TV personality on that network. Jake Tapper is someone that, personally, I have a lot of respect for, because many would forget, during the Obama administration, he was in the White House press briefing room, and he was constantly holding, what was the guy's name at the time? They had a couple of them. Was it Robert Gates? Was he one of them? Maybe that was a defense secretary or something. Carney, was it? Jay Carney? Was he one of the, I think he was one of the press secretaries. He had a couple of them. But he would constantly ask tough questions to the Obama administration, and many on the right praised him because, oh yes, he's holding them accountable. He's asking the questions nobody else wants to ask. Well, now that there's a Republican in the White House, he asks tough questions, and many on the right don't like him. Many famous radio personalities and many famous commentators constantly trash Jake Tapper because he asks tough questions. Tough questions that, you may not like, but in my view, they're fair. So Miller goes on this show and he gets interviewed. This is about a 12-minute interview. You can look it up on YouTube, check it out yourself. And I would encourage you to do that. Don't just take snippets of it from, websites that you like to visit, but actually watch the entire interview on YouTube without any commentary from anybody else and make up your own mind. But if you really want to hear my take on this, you will in just a moment. But here's a couple of clips from that interview. One of them is about a minute or so, and the other one's like a minute and a half, maybe. And I wanted to play these because I think they're very telling, and they will help serve the discussion I want to have with you about the president, his tweets, and what they mean for you and me, and why we have to have a discussion on the greater impact of this country. So here's one of the clips from this interview.
Bannon offered a different take on the Trump Tower meeting between Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, and these other officials, including a Russian lawyer. He called it treasonous and unpatriotic, and he said that, quote, the chance that Don Jr. did not walk these Jamos up to his father's office on the 26th floor is zero. Did President Trump meet with any of the so-called Jamos who were in that Trump Tower meeting?
Steve Bannon's eloquence in that description notwithstanding, it's tragic and unfortunate that Steve would make these grotesque comments so out of touch with reality and obviously so vindictive. And the whole White House staff is deeply disappointed in his comments, which were grotesque. And with respect to the Trump Tower meeting that he's talking about, he wasn't even there when any of this went down, so he's not really a remotely credible source on any of it. It reads like an angry, vindictive person spouting off to a highly discreditable author. The book is best understood as a work of very poorly written fiction. And I also will say that the author is a garbage author of a garbage book.
Okay, so there's the response from Stephen Miller, and he pretty much repeats this over and over and over again when Tapper presses him on this and says, okay, well, you're not answering the question, though. Did the president meet with these people that this author is claiming happened? And he doesn't answer the question. He just keeps saying, how dare you? I've worked with the president. He's an honorable man, and he's tapped into the minds and hearts of the American people. But he doesn't answer the question. And to me, this is a fail. Just answer the question, yes or no. But unfortunately, that's not what people tend to do. They tend to, speechify, and they tend to, say whatever they want to say, instead of just being straight up. So here's part 2. This is later on. This is towards the end of the interview, and this is one of the moments that really stood out to me.
I want to ask you, because you obviously are very offended by the notion that this book, Fire and Fury, paints a picture of President Trump. Trump is not mentally up to the job. On Saturday, President Trump put out a series of tweets trying to defend himself on this issue of fitness. And he said, quote, actually, throughout my life, my 2 greatest assets have been mental stability and being really smart. Crooked Hillary Clinton also played these cards very hard and, as everyone knows, went down in flames. I went from very successful businessman to top TV star to president of the United States on my first try. I think that would qualify as not smart, but genius, and a very stable genius at that. Do you think tweets like that help or hurt the cause that the president is stable and up for the job?
Not only do I think they help it, but I think in the toxic environment that you've created here in CNN and cable news, which is a real crisis of legitimacy for your network, and we saw it, of course, with the extremely fake news you reported about the Don Jr. and WikiLeaks story. There was a huge embarrassment for your network.
Stephen.
Just like the huge embarrassment you had when you got the Comey testimony wrong.
Stephen, I'm trying to get to the issue of the president's fitness, which a lot of people are questioning.
I'm getting to the issue of your fitness, but the president's tweets absolutely reaffirmed the plain-spoken truth. A self-made billionaire revolutionized reality TV and tapped into something magical that's happening in the hearts of this country. The people that you don't...
The president has approval rating in the 30s. I don't know what magical you're talking about.
The people that you don't connect with and understand, the people whose manufacturing jobs have left, who've been besieged by high-crime communities, and who've been affected by a policy of uncontrolled immigration, those voices, those experiences don't get covered on this network. That's why, to prove the point, I was booked to talk about the very issues I'm just describing, and you're not even asking about them because they're not interesting facts to you.
That's not true. I have plenty of questions on immigration. You've attempted to filibuster by talking about your flights with the president. I want to ask you a question because
don't be condescending, Jake.
Stephen, the president and the White House.
The reason why I want to talk about
the president and the White House.
The reason why I want to talk about the president's experiences, what I've seen with him traveling to meet dozens of foreign leaders, with his incredible work.
Okay, you're not answering the questions.
No,
I understand.
You have 24 hours a day of anti-Trump material, and you're not going to give 3 minutes for the American people to hear the real experience of Donald Trump.
There's one viewer that you care about right now, and you're being obsequious. You're being a factotum in order to please him, okay?
No.
And I think I've wasted enough of my viewers' time.
You know who I care about?
Whew. Okay. So that's the gist of it. I mean, that's, when I heard of that part, I just thought, there's so many fails on all sides here. What do we make of all this? I get really tired of those who adore the president so much that they will stand and defend every single thing this man says or does. And it doesn't matter. He's Trump, so he's just perfect. He's just great. He doesn't do anything wrong. And if he does do something wrong, well, it's just Trump being Trump, and we shouldn't judge him. We shouldn't criticize him. To me, this was... let me point out a couple of the failures to you. First of all, let's talk about the obvious failures of Miller. Here's this guy who is supposed to be a senior advisor to the president. He agrees to go on this show knowing full well, going on a network like CNN, he is going to be asked questions like this. But instead of answering the questions, instead of really giving substance to those answers, he filibusters. He repeats himself. He doesn't get to the heart of the issue. And he, like I said, he does not answer the question. He dodges over and over and over again. Just answer the question. And he keeps saying, you won't give me time. He gave you freaking 12 and a half minutes. And you didn't answer the question. You just kept repeating the same thing over and over again, like I'm doing, repeating the same thing. See how annoying that is? Yeah, that's what he kept doing during the entire thing, which eventually would make Tapper interrupt him and say, okay, we need to move on because you're not answering the question. But another fail, though, is on CNN. And the fact that they claim to be so, for the news, they claim to be so for journalism and responsible reporting. They have done such an epic failure of a job on that. Now, I'm not necessarily directing this at Jake Tapper, but as a network as a whole, massive fail. Massive fail. But there are a couple ways to look at this because, I got into a back and forth with somebody on Twitter who was defending Trump and his tweets about his genius and his stability. Well, here's the first rule of, one of the first rules of basic human logic. If you're actually smart, if you're actually stable, then you don't feel the need to constantly tell people how smart you are. If you feel the need to constantly tell people how smart and stable you are, chances are you're not quite as smart and stable as you think. Now, does that mean I think that the president is an idiot? No, I don't. I don't think that Donald Trump is stupid. I really don't. I think he's a very smart guy. But he doesn't need to keep saying that. It just hurts his case. This goes back to what I was saying earlier. I really like what he's been doing as president. I approve of much of his political agenda. But he hurts his own cause when he puts his foot in his mouth like this. This does nothing to help you and me. This is why his approval rating is so low. Because his character is so flawed. His behavior is so childish and immature and foolish. He puts a bad name on himself and other people. And I know we're running out of time here, but I just wanted to say, we have put ourselves in this position of setting a very bad precedent for the future because we have allowed ourselves to make so many excuses for what this president says and does that when a hard leftist comes in and starts doing these very same things, we'll have no ground to stand on. No ground whatsoever because we've made excuses for our own side. Does this hurt the president's chances of being reelected? I don't know. I don't really know. But this is not a good precedent to set because it goes against our very principles. It should go against our very principles, against yours. It goes against mine of humility. He talks about Reagan. Reagan did not constantly remind people of how smart he was. He turned the tables on them. He brought humor into the mix. We need to go back to that instead of doing the very thing that we claim to be against. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Blake Johnson program, very first episode of 2018. I do thank you so much for tuning in. I hope to see you next Monday, same time, same place. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless you.